One thing I talk about a lot in my classes, and something that's really important to me, is Paul's use of the Old Testament. He's often using the Septuagint, sometimes using the Hebrew, depending on kind of the context that he's writing into. And this troubles us a little bit because we teach interpretation and exegesis to our students in a certain way, and then we look in depth at what Paul is doing with the scriptures he's citing, and he's not always within that framework. In fact, he's often not within that framework. So this creates some issues, and I think largely it troubles us because we tend not to understand the Second Temple Jewish context, and that's the context that Paul belongs in. So what he does with Scripture is not what we do with Scripture, but it doesn't mean he doesn't see it as authoritative. I try to explain it to my students in this way. And evangelicalism especially, and anyone who holds to views of inerrancy, however you're going to define that, we tend to think of the authority of the scriptures as demonstrated in their immutability, right? You can't change the text. You have to read it in its historical context and so on. In Second Temple Judaism, they associated the authority of the scriptures with them as living texts. In other words, they perennially speak because the God who gave them is continually speaking. Now, if that's how you're understanding scriptural authority, then you have the freedom to relate the scriptures to your contemporary situation in ways on which we might call foul, right? But the scriptures are living texts, so they're assuming that God is still speaking. So this gives them the freedom to then contemporize them in the way we see it in the Qumran texts, where they're doing pesher, and they're taking, for example, the prophet Habakkuk, and they're saying, oh, this is about the Romans, and this is about us, right? Because within their sort of hermeneutical framework, what they're doing is saying, okay, God has worked in consistent ways in salvation history, so we can pull this forward because we have a fuller revelation now in their sort of eschatological context. Like their framework is, we're at the end of times, right? And so within that perspective, they can actually see everything that's come before more clearly. Paul is doing something similar with the Old Testament texts that he quotes. So this is where we get things like in 1 Corinthians 10, which is one of the passages I focused on. In Paul's reading, the rock from which the Israelites drank in the wilderness is in some sense Christ, right? Now, I don't think we need to somehow read this back into the Old Testament and say, okay, somehow this rock was a pre-incarnate Christophany. We get some odd things when we think we need to do that. What Paul is doing in that passage, though, is interpreting the Old Testament text for a specific contextual purpose, right? So we have to understand what he's doing in his argument. We come to the text sometimes and assume that Paul's goal is to exegete the scriptural texts, but it really isn't. His goal is to use an authoritative text to address his audience and address a very pastoral problem. So what he does is often ad hoc, right? So in that text, really what he's trying to do when he reads the Red Sea crossing in terms of a baptism, and he speaks of them eating the manna in the wilderness in Eucharistic terms, what he's aiming to do there is not establish some sort of abstract theology of Eucharist and baptism or anything else. What he's trying to do is say, look, you've had the same experiences as your ancestors. They had a baptism, you have a baptism. They had manna and spiritual food, and you have the Eucharist, spiritual food. And then his goal of that, setting up that parallel, is to say, listen, they ended up committing idolatry, and they went into judgment. So you are in the same position in wanting to eat idol food, right? That's the goal of the argument. So we have to understand the social function of what Paul is doing with the Old Testament and not try to squish him into our categories of what it means to interpret scripture, because it isn't fair to impose on a Second Temple Jewish author in the first century.